G'day kids, and we're up to Chapter 5, The Prisoners. The temperature had risen while Harvey had been at lunch. A heat haze hovered over the lawn, which was lusher and more thick with flowers than he remembered, and it made the trees around the house shimmer. He headed toward them, calling Wendell's name as he went. There was no reply. He glanced back towards the house, thinking he might see Wendell at one of the windows, but they were all reflecting the pristine blue. He looked from house to heavens. There was not a cloud in sight. And now a suspicion stole upon him, which grew into a certainty as his gaze wandered back to the shimmering copse of the flowers underfoot. During the hour he had spent in the cool of the kitchen, the season had changed. Summer had come to Mr. Hood's holiday house, a summer as magical as the spring that had preceded it. That was why the sky was so faultlessly blue, and the birds making such music. The leaf-laden branches were no less content, nor the blossoms in the grass, nor the bees that buzzed from bloom to bloom, gathering the season's bounty. All were in bliss. It would not be a long season, Harvey guessed. If the spring had been over in a morning, then most likely this perfect summer would not outlast the afternoon. I'd better make the most of it, he thought, and hurried in search of Wendell. He finally discovered his friend sitting in the shade of the trees with a pile of comics at his side. "Want to sit down and read?" he asked. "Maybe later," said Harvey. "First I want to go and look at this lake you were talking about. Are you going to come?" "What for? I told you it's no fun." "All right, I'll go on my own." "You won't stay long," Wendell remarked, and went back to his reading. Though Harvey had a good idea of the lake's general whereabouts, the bushes on that side of the house were thick and thorny, and it took him several minutes to find a way through them. By the time he caught sight of the lake itself, the sweat on his face and back was clammy, and his arms had been scratched and bloodied by barbs. As Wendell had predicted, the lake wasn't worth the trouble. It was large, so large that the far side was barely visible, but gloomy and drear. Both the lake and the dark stones around it covered with a film of green scum. There was a legion of flies buzzing around in search of something rotten to feed on, and Harvey guessed they'd have no trouble finding a feast. This was a place where dead things belonged. He was about to leave when a movement in the shadows caught his eye. Somebody was standing further along the bank, almost eclipsed by the mesh of thicket. He moved a few paces closer to the lake and saw that it was Lulu. She was perched on the slimy stones at the very edge of the water, gazing into their depths. Speaking in a near whisper for fear he'd startle her, Harvey said, "It looks cold." She glanced up at him, her face full of confusion, and then, without a word of reply, turned and bounded away through the bushes. "Wait!" Harvey called, hurrying towards the lake. Lulu had already disappeared, however, leaving the thicket shaking. He might have gone in pursuit of her, but the sound of bubbles breaking in the lake took his gaze to the waters, and there, moving just below the coating of scum, he saw the fish. They were almost as large as he was, their grey scales stained and encrusted, their bulbous eyes turned up toward the surface like the eyes of prisoners in a watery pit. They were watching him, he was certain of that, and their scrutiny made him shudder. Were they hungry, he wondered, and praying to see their fishy gods that he'd slip on the stones and tumble in? Or were they wishing he'd come with a rod and a line, so they could be hauled from the depths and put out of their misery? What a life, he thought. No sun to warm them, no flowers to sniff, or no games to play. Just the deep, dark waters to circle in and circle and circle and circle. It made him dizzy just watching, and he feared that if he lingered much longer, he'd lose his balance and join them. Gasping with relief, he turned his back on the sight and returned into the sunlight as fast as the barbs would allow. Wendell was still sitting underneath a tree. He had 2 bottles of ice-cold soda in the grass beside him, and lobbed one to Harvey as he approached. "Well?" he said. "You were right," Harvey replied. "Nobody in their right minds ever goes there." "I saw Lulu." "What did I tell you?" Wendell crowed. "Nobody in their right minds." "And those fish." "Yeah, I know," Wendell said, pulling a face. "Ugly boogers, aren't they?" "Why would Mr. Hood have fish like that? I mean, everything else is so beautiful. The lawns, the house, the orchard." "Who cares?" said Wendell. "I do," said Harvey. "I want to know everything there is to know about this place." "Why?" "So I can tell my mum and dad about it when I get home." "Home?" said Wendell. "Who needs it? We've got everything we need here." "I'd still like to know how it all works. Is there some kind of machine making the seasons change?" Wendell pointed up through the branches at the sun. "Does that look mechanical to you?" he said. "Don't be a dope, Harvey. This is all real. It's magic, but it's real." "You think so?" "It's too hot to think," Wendell replied. "Now sit down and shut up." He tossed a few comics in Harvey's direction. "Look through these. Find yourself a monster for tonight." "What's happening tonight?" "Halloween, of course," Wendell said. "It happens every night." Harvey plunked himself down beside Wendell, opened his soda, and began to leaf through the comics, thinking as he leafed he'd sip that maybe Wendell was right, and it was too hot to think. However, this miraculous place worked. It seemed real enough. The sun was hot, the soda was cold, the sky was blue, the grass was green. What else more did he need to know? Somewhere in the middle of these musings he must have dozed off, because he woke with a start to find that the sun was no longer dappling to the ground around him, and Wendell was no longer reading at his side. He reached for his soda, but the bottle had fallen over, and the scent of sweet cherry had attracted hundreds of ants. They were crawling all over it and into it, many drowning for their greed. As he got to his feet, the first real breeze he'd felt since noon blew. A leaf, its edges sere, spiraled down to land at his feet. "Autumn," he murmured to himself. Until this moment, standing beneath the creaking boughs, watching the wind shake down the leaves, autumn had always seemed to him the saddest of seasons. It meant that summer was over and the nights would be growing long and cold. But now, as the drizzle of leaves became a deluge and the patter of acorns and chestnuts a drumming, he laughed to see and hear it coming. By the time he was out from under the trees, he had leaves in his hair, and down his back he was kicking them up with every racing step. As he reached the porch, the first clouds he had seen all afternoon crept over the sun, and their shadow made the house, which had wavered in the heat of the afternoon like a mirage, suddenly loom dark and solid. "You're real," he said, as he stood panting on the porch. "You are, aren't you?" He started to laugh at the foolishness of talking to a house, but the smile went from his face as a voice so soft he was barely certain he had heard it said, "What do you think, child?" He looked for the speaker, but there was nobody at the threshold, nor out on the porch, nor on the steps behind him. "Who said that?" he demanded. There was no answer, which he was glad of. It hadn't been a voice after all, he told himself. It had been a creak of the boards underfoot, or the rustling of dry leaves in the grass. But he stepped into the house with his heart beating a little faster, reminding himself as he went that questions weren't welcome here. What did it matter anyway, he thought, whether this place was real or a dream? It felt real, and that was all that mattered. Satisfied with this, he raced through the house into the kitchen where Mrs. Griffin was weighing the table down with treats. Chapter 7, Seen and Unseen. "Well," said Wendell as they ate, "what are you going to be tonight?" "I don't know," Harvey said. "What are you going to be?" "A hangman," he said with a spaghetti grin. I've been learning how to tie nooses. Now all I've got to do is find someone to hang." He eyed Mrs. Griffin. "It's quick," he said. "You just drop 'em and snap. Their necks break." "That's horrible," Mrs. Griffin said. "Why do boys always love talking about ghosts and murders and hangings?" "Because it's exciting," Wendell said. "You're monsters," she replied with a hint of a smile. "That's what you are. Monsters." "Harvey is," Wendell said. "I've seen him filing down his teeth." "Is it a full moon?" Harvey said, smearing ketchup around his mouth and putting on a twitch. "I hope so. I need blood. Fresh blood." "Good," said Wendell. "You can be a vampire. I'll hang 'em and you can suck their blood." "Good." "Horrible," Mrs. Griffin said again. "Just horrible." Perhaps the house had heard Harvey wishing for a full moon, because when he and Wendell trapezed upstairs and looked over the landing window, there, hanging between the bare branches of the trees, was a moon as wide and white as a dead man's smile. "Look at it," Harvey said. "I can see every crater. It's perfect." "Oh, that's just the start," Wendell promised, and led Harvey to a large, musty room which had been filled with clothes of every description. Some were hung on hooks and coat hangers. Some were in baskets like actors' costumes. Still more were heaped by the far end of the room on the dusty floor, and half hidden until Wendell cleared the way was a sight that made Harvey gasp, a wall covered from floor to ceiling with masks. "Where do they all come from?" Harvey said as he gaped at this spectacle. "Mr. Hood collects them," Wendell explained. "And the clothes are just stuff the kids who visited here left behind." Harvey wasn't interested in the clothes. It was the masks that mesmerized him. They were like snowflakes, no two alike. Some were made of wood and some of plastic, some of straw and cloth, some of paper mache. Some were as bright as parrots, others were as pale as parchment. Some were so grotesque he was certain they had been carved by crazy people, others so perfect they looked like the death masks of angels. There were masks of clowns and foxes, masks like skulls, decorated with real teeth, and one with the carved flames instead of hair. "Take your pick," said Wendell. "There's bound to be a vampire somewhere. Whatever I come in here wanting to find, I'll find it sooner or later." Harvey decided to leave the pleasure of choosing a mask until last, and concentrated instead on digging up something sustainably bat-like to wear. As he worked through the piles of clothes, he found himself wondering about the children who'd left them here. Though he'd always hated history lessons, he knew some of the jackets and shoes and shirts and belts had been out of fashion for many, many years. Where were their owners now? Dead, he presumed, or so old it made no difference. The thought of these garments belonging to dead folk brought a little shudder to his spine, which was only right. This was Halloween, after all, and what was Halloween without a few chills? After a few minutes of searching, he found a long black coat with a collar he could turn up, which Wendell pronounced very vampiric. Well satisfied with his choice, he went back to the wall of faces, and his eyes almost immediately alighted upon a mask he hadn't previously seen. With the pallor of deep sockets of a soul just risen from the tomb, he took it down and put it on. It fitted perfectly. "What do I look like?" Harvey asked, turning to face Wendell, who had just found an executioner's mask, which fitted him just as well. "Ugly as sin." "That's good." There was a flickering family of pumpkin heads lined up on the porch where they stepped outside, and the misty air smelled of smoke and wood. "Where do we go trick-or-treating?" Harvey wanted to know. "Out in the street?" "No," said Wendell. "It's not Halloween out in the real world, remember. We're going to go around to the back of the house." "That's not very far," Harvey remarked, disappointed. "It is at this time of night," Wendell said creepily. "This house is full of surprises. You'll see." Harvey looked at the house through the tiny eye-holes of his mask. It loomed as large as Thunderhead, and its weather vanes sharp enough to stab the stars. "Come on," said Wendell. "We've got a long trip ahead." A long trip? Harvey thought. How could there be a long trip from the front of the house to the back? But once again, Wendell was right. The house was full of surprises. The trip, which would have been a 2-minute walk in the bright afternoon, soon became a trek that had Harvey wishing